All right. So just to start out, Bridge, tell me a little bit about what you're up to right now, More Perfect, and why you got involved in pro democracy work.
So it's interesting, Scott. I worked for been working for 20 years on malaria control in Africa, and a game-changing development was the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals that actually brought different institutions, indigenous and in Africa, multilaterals, public-private, together around clear goals, targets, plans to meet them. And it was extraordinary, the results that have been achieved because of the cooperative effort. So inspired by that, the big idea was to advance 5 sustainable democracy goals. And interestingly, the first person I talked to about a broad-based collaboration said collaborations are unnatural acts among non-consenting adults. So it was not easy to foster collaboration, but More Perfect is now a historic alliance among 37 of the nation's presidential centers, the National Archives Foundation, which is collective memory of the nation at the archives, the American Academy that produced this great bipartisan Our Common Purpose report, and more than 100 partners who are working together to advance these 5 sustainable democracy goals. And even in this difficult environment on universal civic learning, national service and volunteering, bridging divides, trusted elections, effective governance, and access to trusted news and information, we're seeing really significant progress, which is encouraging.
What? So I appreciate the notion that cooperation is not natural, and I've seen that in the sector too. How have you incentivized or actually gotten groups to the table to cooperate and collaborate to the extent that that's happened?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we made it a serious effort. We said we're going to do this over 18 months. We tapped leaders and institutions that were extremely, active in the space and had things to offer. Even the exercise of, sharing what one to the other was doing and seeing how the sum of the part, the whole was more than the sum of the parts was even more effective than we realized initially. And then obviously the alignment of effort inspired philanthropy. One leading philanthropist told me, there are all these organizations sort of bursting into the democratic renewal space, but it's like the Wild West. I can't tell what the return on investment is. And so, and she had worked in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have found the alignment of effort has really helped bring philanthropy to the table in ways that, they hadn't come before.
So it seems like that notion of like rising tide lifts all boats. I mean, and bringing philanthropy to the table seems um, useful and incentivizing. So the Sustainable Development Goals, knowing a little bit about them, I mean, able to get like a cross section of agreement on these are effective sustainable development goals. I'm curious, like how you came up with the 5 sustainable democracy goals and how there's alignment on those goals. Are there people saying, well, you should focus on this or you should focus on that? How much have you been able to say like these are really the 5 things to focus on?
Yeah, it was interesting. We reviewed over 50 reports, studies, commissions, including we had testified on the to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences commission that produced that bipartisan Our Common Purpose report. And looking at what did we think specifically could be achieved coming out of those and other recommendations, we developed these 5 pillars of democratic renewal. And I have to tell you, I was pleasantly surprised about how little pushback we had. I expected people to, ask us to go in other areas. And there were examples like, expand the House of Representatives. In the context of when that was envisioned, the populations were much smaller. Now they're bursting at the seams, for one representative. That's a legitimate idea, but we didn't see that happening, in the coming years. So things like that we left off, but we've and there's a logic to them. If Americans don't understand democratic norms, values, and institutions through civic learning, you can't have a democracy. They also need rites of passage as they come of age to exercise their civic muscles and give back to community and country through national service or serious volunteering, on and on, all the way to we need an environment where we have some level of shared truth and shared facts from which we can function. And that's why access to trusted news and information, including revitalizing local news, which has been called democracy's immune system, is so vitally important.
That's super helpful. So you're someone, I mean, again, appreciate the context on sustainable development. I know you've done a lot on service. When you sort of came into the democracy space, um, what do you think? What was sort of your perspective on it? You talked about the Wild West. Um, Sort of, why do you think that this approach was so needed? And to extrapolate a little bit more, what do you think is not working in this space right now? What do you think some of the biggest challenges are right now, and how does this effort, but other work that you're thinking about, solve some of those challenges?
So my history on it more deliberately, I was director of the White House Domestic Policy Council for President Bush, and but then 9/11 hit, and he asked for a major initiative to foster a culture of service, citizenship, and responsibility, and that put me directly into the democratic renewal space. And we had a summit. It was effectively a White House summit on democratic renewal, and we had invited the president of Latvia over to talk about what it was like to live in a country with the absence of democracy, norms, values, institutions, because Americans sort of took those things for granted. But in that context, we had tremendous support at the federal level. We had civic education, hundreds of millions of dollars, people like Robert Byrd and Lamar Alexander working across the aisle to make those things happen. We had the largest expansion of national service programs like VISTA, AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, post 9/11 disaster preparedness and response. So there was a huge infusion of federal energy from the president and the Congress to support this work. The irony is today, 95% of our work is at the state and local levels. And even though our plans include a lot of federal legislation like election infrastructure, or the Civic Secures Democracy Act, or the Bridging Divides for Service Act, we don't envision any of those things moving anytime soon. But the positive news on the flip side is after 9/11, there wasn't really the infrastructure. Like on civic learning, iCivics didn't exist. Bill of Rights Institute was just getting off the ground. The Educating for American Democracy roadmap wasn't in place. Now we have that infrastructure that can support work at the local and state levels, which is a real advantage that we didn't have before.
Super helpful. Let's actually let's go down that civics education road for. I mean, I'm familiar with the space. I'm curious to get a sense of, like, what does success look like for you in that space? And so, like, you have iCivics, you have Bill of Rights. One of the criticisms of civics education for a while has been, great, but how does this scale? Right? That I've heard is, great, but how does it scale? And so I'm curious, like, if you can walk me through, like, success for this. How does this actually, I mean, how are you helping these organizations beyond what they're able to do have potentially broader impact than they would be able to have on their own? That might be a little leading, but I'm curious, like, what
Oh,
you all are doing to.
it's a great question. One of the first people I reached out to after 9/11 was historian David McCullough. And he said every state constitution, and by the way, state constitutions don't get enough attention, makes the education inquiry focus on educating citizens, civic education. And yet K-12 and particularly higher ed had sort of lost their way in terms of focusing on that inquiry. So working with iCivics, Bill of Rights Institute, Daniel Allen at the Ash Center, who was a leader at the Educating American Democracy Roadmap, Yuval Levin at AEI, Raj Vinakoda, a whole group of people who were, in the trenches, working away. We pulled together a plan of action. And just to give you one example, we took that plan to the IBIS board, presented it. Every single board member commented on how the alignment of effort was so powerful, the clarity on making states and school districts make civic education a priority again, not just with a civics course, but the civic inquiry across the curriculum. So kids in math are learning how Armstrong went to the moon. Kids in science are learning about, the role they can play as stewards in the environment, on and on. Second, teacher capacity. A lot of these civics courses have been taught by coaches or people who aren't trained. And so, with the Educating American Democracy framework, which is inquiry based and was supported by both the Trump and Biden administrations, it's a great framework to scale quality teacher capacity across the country, because you have to have quality teachers to teach civic education. And then third, working to support action among governors and states and policy changes and reforms that makes that work a real priority, across the country. And the number of states, both for middle school and high school, have increased. And then Melody Barnes and I have worked together to create the Higher Education Democracy Initiative with AAC&U and Campus Compact to identify and bring scalable innovations to more colleges and universities. And Stanford and Johns Hopkins have created this tool and assessment where any campus can get a baseline understanding of the reach of their civic education and engagement efforts, so that we can actually measure results over time.
So that super concrete. I think subsequent question on that is how do you make sure that the efforts aren't seen as partisan? And I'm curious about that from the overall perspective. And I know that like it's easy to say civics education is not partisan, but we're in a country where there's so much like
Yeah.
everything becomes partisan. And so how are you navigating that right now?
It's a great question. So we found the power of the original record of our history, and I learned this a little bit after 9/11 too. So we have this initiative with the National Archives called Our Documents. It lifts up 100 milestone documents across U.S. history, recognizing that we've always been divided. In fact, we were exclusionary at the founding. Large parts of the population couldn't participate in our democracy. But we created a constitutional system that people need to understand, that enabled us to transcend differences to effect change and solve public challenges. And so, an inquiry based model connected to the original record of our history, starting with the Charters of Freedom, is a very powerful way, and tends to enable the teaching and engagement on our history and system in a way that kind of transcends the partisan divide. I'd also say the American Historical Association did a survey of teachers, and Jim Grossman, who heads up the effort, it showcased that the political indoctrinization that was the concern about who's teaching and how is civic education being taught, that didn't emerge as a prominent problem on the ground in schools and districts across the United States, red and blue states alike. So that's a little bit of a myth. What the real issue was: quality teaching. Do we have the capacity? Is this a state priority? Is it something that's in the standards and that we're required to teach? Do we have an incentive to teach it? And thanks to iCivics and a lot of other groups, those commitments are growing.
Do you appreciate the point on that? Is some of this too I mean, you talked about the distinction between some of the Bush era efforts on the federal and much of this work being local. Is some of this, I don't want to be crass as to say avoiding what's happening at the federal level, but just with that point on education, I'm curious I mean, and I don't want to make this a partisan point, but there's so much concern. I mean, in the last 4 years, it was from Republicans towards Democrats. Now it's Democrats towards Republicans of what's happening at the federal level. When you think about these goals, how much do you take into account what's happening at the federal level versus avoiding it versus being adjacent to it? I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. The First of all, just practically, we're able to move these agendas at the state and local levels. We're working with Governor Spencer Cox in Utah, and Governor Wes Moore in Maryland, and Governor Kevin Newsom in California, and Governor Kevin Stitt in Oklahoma, and Governor Kemp in Georgia. There's an appetite. First of all, there's an interest in many of these goals. and an appetite to actually do things in their states and localities. Practically speaking, with the downsizing of government and the efforts underway at the federal level, and Congress not engaging on these issues, there just isn't practically the appetite we see to move these pieces of legislation that are part of our plans. Now, does that mean we're never going to pursue those things? Absolutely not. Are we going to leverage the 250th in creative ways to create energy? And ours is a decadal effort. We're launching a major campaign in connection with the 250th in a nonpartisan way that will focus on America's capabilities, not its brokenness. Get people to recognize that in a democracy, which is a demanding form of government, they have power and agency. To solicit contributions and commitments from institutions and Americans to help advance these goals and improve our union, and try to identify the sources of solidarity by talking to people on the right, on the left, in the middle. What's encouraging to me, most Americans self-identify through family, friends, faith, work, community. Political affiliation is last. And the national news is driving a narrative as if everything's politics. So we've got to have centers of influence and sources of solidarity that remind Americans of what binds us together, the values of freedom, equality of opportunity, tolerance, pluralism, and then how our system works. So they, as the highest office in the land, Mortimer Adler wrote this little pamphlet called We Hold These Truths, where he said, uniquely in a democracy, citizen, not president, not governor, not senator, is the highest office of the land. And we have to remind Americans that all transformational change, as Doris Kearns Goodwin reminded us at the launch of More Perfect, was first catalyzed by private citizens, often with no public platform, who had an idea, cared about a place, cared about a cause, and helped affect change in the country. Ultimately, you do have to go to government for scale. And for the moment, we're looking at the national picture from the perspective of what can we do across all the states. And we hope that energy from the ground up will eventually inform our federal policymakers to take a hold of these issues and help advance them as well. Election infrastructure, civic education, national service, in particular, are issues that merit a national level of support.
I'm struck by that notion of I mean, one, people aren't identifying by political affiliation first, but the national media might have you think otherwise. Like, how do you tell that story in a different way? And it makes me think of two. I mean, when you talk about post 9/11 and people have written about this, it seems to be and you were intimately involved in this, but one of the last true moments in American history, it seems like, where people did come together over something bigger than themselves in a unified way, right? Where we don't have, I mean, you think about, I mean, again, you weren't intimately involved, but everything that happened afterwards, President Bush throwing out the first pitch in the World Series, like these moments where, like, the pride was there, and it just seems very difficult to imagine. And I don't know if the 250th, I mean, you tell me, but like, how do you think about creating that broader ethos when so much is so polarized, and it seems like the media incentive is to continue that polarization?
Yeah, there are strong incentives. We're not naive. People in their social media silos getting only kind of information that may appeal to them, or may even be untruthful. AI may accelerate those trends. There's, a lot of energy on the extremes of our politics, and some reforms, frankly, that are needed to also enable candidates that are willing to cross the aisle more effectively to work together. But my hope is that a lot more ground up energy that bridges people together at the local and state levels, kind of sets the example of what can be done, showcases people coming together to solve difficult public problems, and a campaign that tells those stories. I don't know if you saw the ads in connection with the Olympics, but it
Yeah.
was such a contrast of hope and capability. And so we've had times in our country, worked closely with Robert Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone, but he also wrote The Upswing. And he showed that the
Right.
same gloomy trends we had in the Gilded Age, there was a bit of a formula, and David Brooks talked about it at our Mount Vernon summit. Shifts in the culture. What are our sources of solidarity? What do we value? What do we trust? What are our ideals as a country? Then community-based enterprise, an explosion of community-based organizations, civil society, knitting people together across difference to solve problems, and eventually bubbling up to country-level leadership, people in the Congress, the president, people in public service who reflect those values. We know that's a generational enterprise. And I was just at a talk the other night at our Karsh Institute board meeting that Melody Barnes so effectively leads. And the speaker talked about something the Our Common Purpose report recommended was we need to envision a third or fourth founding in this country and kind of recommit in the modern age with the modern problems to our ideals and our values in a way that knits us together. We know we're going to have differences, but to ensure our system holds. Because when there are sources of solidarity, you can maintain democracy. When there are not, it can become a very different system.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and that notion of another founding seems like it could be something that actually does bring people together and allows people to re-envision. Two last questions on opposite sides of this, but sort of going off of what you were just saying. I mean, what are you when you think about the broader pro democracy space right now? What are you most worried about? What do you think the biggest pitfalls are if folks don't get strategic over the next few years?
So Judge Learned Hand said, when liberty dies in the hearts and minds of the people, no court, no law, no constitution can save it. And with historian John Meacham kicked off our More Perfect launch a few years ago, he said something to the effect like, "These are great pillars of democracy. These are fundamental to American renewal, but you also need constitutional character." And that's why people having courage, our leaders having courage, standing up and supporting our Constitution and our system, ensuring we have checks and balances in the system, and then educating the public of how central that is to their own liberty and their own freedom. It's we the people. I mean, the remarkable thing about our constitutional system is it's a remarkable North Star for a nation, which is continuous improvement. It's a spirit of humility. We've never been perfect. We're going to, work toward a more perfect union. And the means of getting there is each other, we the people. And so getting more people in the enterprise around constitutional character, advancing these goals, and being part of an effort for the 250th that awakens them to the fact, Mortimer Adler said, most Americans, I fear, look at our public leaders. Sometimes they see the dysfunction and they despair. But in a democracy, citizen is the highest office of the land, and we have to activate them. And so I like to think about, why don't we make citizen a verb? It's an activation, and people ought to realize across history, from the citizen soldiers who fostered the revolution to Martin Luther King, who had no public appointment and ushered in a civil rights movement, to many, many other Americans who've helped create what we are today. That's the spirit we need to bring to the enterprise, not just looking at public officials and complaining, but getting active ourselves and helping to affect change.
So the last question was going to be about what is making you hopeful, and so I guess I'm curious: are you seeing more of that from the organizations you work with, individuals that you're working with right now?
Yeah, what is so optimistic, this More Perfect Alliance, the fact that 37 presidential senators from Washington's Mount Vernon through both Bush's, Reagan, the Obama Foundation have all come together to collaborate for the first time in history in meaningful ways. Some of them are polling places and highly trusted polling places in their regions. Others are fabulous, millions of people pouring in to learn about pieces and parts of our history, engage civically. Others unleashing young people to serve, neighbor and nation. Those things are also uplifting, in the network of partners who have, made the voluntary step to collaborate around the advancement of 5 sustainable democracy goals is extremely helpful. And so every day working on these different enterprises, it makes me so optimistic because ultimately it's the creativity, ingenuity, and entrepreneurial spirit of the American people that have always ushered in changes, progress toward a more perfect union. And I think that's the spirit we need more than ever today.
Really appreciate that, Bridge. That's I mean, yeah, really appreciate the work that you're doing and the reflections here. This is great.
And thanks for what you're doing at Agora. And it's really extraordinary. We're thrilled to have you as part of the effort.
Yeah, excited, excited.